the topic for tonight is about political donations and whether they are a problem for our democracy. Now, I suspect that probably everyone who's in this session would answer yes to that, at least federally, if not also in other parts of other Australian parliaments. I think it's important to understand why donations are important to recipients. And this applies whether it's something as simple as a pen, and I've got one example here, which creates a favourable impression in the recipient of the person who's been the donor. And that applies whether it's a matter of really trifling value, such as this particular pen, or whether it's a gift of a substantial amount of campaign funds. So it's that really underlies the whole problem with political finance. Now, to move on from that general point, answering yes really tells us very little about how to address the problem, and it's that I want to get to in my comments. And I also want to make the point that I think that over the long term, we should be quite optimistic about the possibility of reform. Because if we look back over the past, let's say, 5 decades, there have been huge improvements in the integrity of the electoral system at the Commonwealth level, and even more in the states and territories. So just to illustrate that point, now we have each vote being of equal value rather than some voters having a more powerful voice than others. The voting age has been extended to 18 years. The electoral boundaries are no longer decided by incumbent governments, and redistributions are conducted by commissions which are independent of government. And those decisions can be overridden by Parliament, but that never happens. There is total confidence in the commissioners of the electoral commissions. Now, if you compare that with the United States commonplace gerrymandering of federal district boundaries by state legislatures, and also the legalised voter suppression, in other words, introduction of laws which have the effect of making it more difficult for some people to vote than for others. So that background of impressive progress over the last 50 years or so provides a foundation for us to take some further lessons, especially in respect of campaign finance, which we can learn from well-established electoral law and practice amongst Australian states and territories and other countries. And I'll come to some examples. In particular, we should look into political donor contributions to political candidates and parties. And these vary considerably between classes of donors. The most obvious classes of donors are members of political parties, individual supporters who may not be members of parties, and businesses. Now, the members of political parties are overwhelmingly individuals who support the values of their party. They may be people who participate in policy making, pre-selection of candidates, campaign activities, and fundraising. I think we can fairly say that the donations by party members reflect their commitment to the party, but overall they are quite a minuscule proportion of donations, particularly when you compare them with those by businesses. Donations by individuals who are not party members vary very widely, from simple donations of $50 or $100 here or there, and the ticket price they pay to go to fundraising events. These, I suggest, are not a major source of funds. It's the donations by businesses that make up the great majority of donations reported to the Electoral Commission. And those donations are made up by a tiny proportion of businesses. And amongst that tiny proportion, there's a worrying bias to donors from businesses that benefit from government contracts, government grants, and government approvals. There's a further problem that the directors of corporations face if they choose to use company funds for making donations. And I won't repeat what Charles had to say about that. All classes of donations are subject to a disclosure threshold, currently $14,500 per year. Donations below that threshold partly account for the half of all donations that are not disclosed and remain unknown and hidden to the general public. So these facts then tell us what happens and why, but not why. The reasons for why are really pretty obvious. Candidates and their parties need to communicate their personalities and their policies to voters. And voters, as Charles said, have a reasonable expectation that they will receive information relevant to their voting from candidates. This communication is expensive and competitive. Each of the parties is trying to get ahead of the other with the sophistication and coincidentally the cost of their campaign techniques. So political parties and candidates are engaged in what's sometimes called an arms race, and to compete they have to use every advantage and opportunity they may have to raise the funds needed to do so. They seek to outdo their competitors, which drives them to maximise their campaign funds. So it's this need to attract funds that creates pressures on leading members and officials of political parties and on candidates to raise funds. They will look for ways and means around legislation, limiting donations, and spend as much as they've got available. There are, of course, improvements to disclosures, but disclosure alone cannot address the underlying issues, and we see that it has little effect in practice. Without reform, Australia is becoming an increasingly unequal society where wealth, whether it's personal or corporate, equates with the ability to influence and to control the narrative, which undermines democracy. Excessive inequality disenfranchises the majority of voters, harms the most vulnerable, and destroys social cohesion. Accordingly, caps on donations are a necessary but not sufficient measure to counter the pressures on parties and candidates to raise ever more funds to meet increasing campaign expenditure. I'm just being invaded by a cat here. I hope she doesn't clog the screen. So turning then to electoral expenditure, without campaign funding reform, Australian electorates will continue to be offered candidates by major parties, candidates who are pre-selected for their association with campaign donors and with party power-based interests. I'm not saying that applies to every candidate, but it certainly is an influence in candidate selection. So without campaign funding reform, Australian electorates will continue to be offered major party candidates who are pre-selected for their association with campaign donors and party power-based interests. So there is, in fact, some pretty strong research evidence from Australia and internationally that confirms a number of features about caps on expenditure. They affect not only who is elected, but who chooses to run. In other words, where there are caps on expenditure, then that is going to have some effect on who's going to run. Where the caps are decreased, that leads to an increase in the number of candidates who run for office in each electorate, and candidates are more likely to be less wealthy on average. And where the caps are more stringent, they lead to the election of less wealthy candidates on average and of candidates who spend less of their own funds in campaigns. And they lead to re-election rates which are lower in places with more stringent expenditure caps, suggesting that expenditure limits reduce the advantage of incumbency. Now, that's bad news for those who are currently in Parliament, but it's good news for democracy. Now, research which has been done particularly in Australia has found that although party or candidates with the deepest votes don't always win, there is generally a quite positive relationship, as you would expect, between expenditure and electoral performance. And money appeared to deliver similar electoral benefits to those seen internationally, although the size of that benefit varied in connection with the political volatility at any given election. There's some interesting comparisons done by this researcher comparing election expenditure in Queensland and New South Wales before and after the caps were introduced. And that research shows that caps do work to level the playing field, but also that parties continue to receive substantial donations, which ironically then could not be spent on campaigning. The introduction of caps seems to have significantly reduced financial disparities between the two major parties in Queensland, at least on the expenditure side. The ALP and the Liberal National Party went from expending vastly different amounts in their campaigns to having budgets that were almost identical, as is evident from their respective expenditure per voter figures. The introduction of caps has somewhat narrowed the financial gap between the major parties and their minor counterparts, but again, that's only on the expenditure side. Again, referring to Queensland data, and I quote here, minor parties do not spend or receive anything like the amount of money that major parties do, regardless of what campaign finance rules are in place. While the ratio of minor to major party expenditure fell in 2012, the Greens were still expending just 18 cents per voter compared to approximately $2.60 for each of the major parties. And in that particular election, One Nation spent less than 1 cent per voter. Now, those comments by Rayner suggest that donation and expenditure caps do not have a substantial benefit to minor parties at a state level. There is some evidence from New South Wales that they may have some advantage in individual electorates. So to go on then a bit further then, Australian states have a wide range of electoral financing rules, and those are much more stringent than the virtual absence of them at the federal level. So the federal system, a federal electoral system, in fact, has no caps at all on campaign expenditure, and the competition between the major parties is driving up expenditure on elections, funded largely by donations from individuals to some extent, associations to also a minor extent, and other organisations being businesses. And of course, those donors have a vested interest in the outcome of the decisions. The current cap on for disclosure purposes is $14,500 per year by any one donor. And that means that the figures, donations below $14,500 are made anonymously. And even then, they are not listed in the donations until the 20 weeks after the end of the financial year. So there are a lot of weaknesses in the current federal system. The current federal financial regime has resulted in an election expenditure arms race, as I was saying before, and that seems to be the greater the expenditure, the more likely electoral success. This competition to raise increasing amounts of money for elections places Australia at great risk of corruption and excessive influence. Large amounts of funds are raised by candidates and parties from donors whose identity is not disclosed, that so-called dark money. As a result, the public perceives that high levels of corruption are associated with donations. And I make the point that that is perception. It's my view, and I think the research probably supports it, that the public perception of the level of corruption is a gross exaggeration of what actually happens. That's not to say that there is no corruption in relations between politicians and political donors to political campaigns. Now, that perception erodes public trust in governments and elected representatives and amplifies the sense of powerlessness in voters, creates apathy, and creates disengagement in the democratic system that serves the interests of the vested interests of the many who are behind the funding. So manifestations of the problems include that party parliamentary party members in particular, that is MPs, attend private fundraising dinners and other functions with the express purpose of giving attendees, that is prospective donors, privileged access to ministers or shadow ministers, which comprise their entrusted responsibility as public officers. These donors whose identities are disclosed are disproportionately individuals or entities who gain from government approvals, contracts and grants. I see that my time is just about over, so I'll just move on quickly to skip over some tables which I'm happy to make available to people. But just to move to the sorts of recommendations which I think are important. And before that, I'll just make the point that the levels of funding which are provided and the levels of the limits on expenditure which apply where there are caps on expenditure are very much lower than the amount of money which is actually spent by the political parties in the federal system. So the distinction there is that it's only a couple of dollars or so per voter is spent by in the jurisdictions which have a cap on expenditure, but there is something like $29 per voter expended by the major parties in the federal system. I do have some notes about the points that Charles was making about the arguments against expenditure caps. I'm in full agreement with Charles on that. So can I just then come to my recommendations for caps? That is, first recommendation that there should be caps on electoral expenditure for candidates, political parties, associated entities, and third-party campaigner entities to reduce the arms race and lessen the influence of individual donors. Secondly, cap should be equivalent on a dollar per vote basis to those applying to elections to the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. That's a system that's been well established and seems to be operating very smoothly. Thirdly, the cost of campaign staff employed by candidates and parties, such as campaign workers, and the cost of materials or advertising supplied by parties should be included as costs subject to the cap. Donations should be limited to donors who are on the electoral roll, in other words, no corporate donations. Donations should be limited to $1,000 per year per donor, and donations should be disclosed within 2 business days of receipt, which is obviously very simply done with electronic record keeping and information transmission. So those are the recommendations which I make.